Hello there, and welcome back. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. Maybe the day has been long, maybe your thoughts are still moving, or maybe you simply want a quiet ride through one of the saddest stories in Red Dead Redemption 2. There is nothing you need to solve right now. Let the room settle. Let your breathing slow. Let the campfire burn low somewhere in the dark. Tonight, we are following the rise and fall of the Van Der Linde gang, from the old dream of freedom to the cold ruins of betrayal, sickness, fear, and broken faith. The Van Der Linde gang did not begin as a monster. That is what makes its fall hurt. It began as a family for people who had been thrown away, a camp of thieves and dreamers, wounded children grown into outlaws, women who needed shelter, men who needed purpose, and a leader who could turn hunger into hope with a few beautiful words. Dutch Van Der Linde promised them freedom. Hosea Matthews gave the dream patience and wit. Arthur Morgan gave it strength. John Marston, Abigail, Jack, Susan, Javier, Bill, Charles, Sadie, Lenny, Tilly, Mary Beth, Pearson, Swanson, Sean, and the rest gave it life. For a while, the gang was not only a criminal outfit, it was a moving home. But every home built on violence carries a storm inside it. The gang robbed and ran, survived and laughed, helped some people and hurt others, and kept telling itself that one more score would lead to safety. Then Blackwater happened. The dream cracked. The money was lost. People died. Dutch crossed a line he could never honestly explain. From that moment on, the gang was no longer only running from the law. It was running from the truth about itself. The Blackwater incident is powerful because Red Dead Redemption 2 never shows it directly. The story begins after it. We arrive in the aftermath, with the gang freezing in the mountains, wounded, frightened, missing people, missing money, and trying to make sense of what just happened. That absence is part of the mystery. Blackwater becomes larger because we do not see it with our own eyes. We hear it in fragments. We hear it in Dutch's defensiveness, Arthur's suspicion, Hosea's disappointment, John's injuries, Javier's loyalty, Micah's strange confidence, and the fear that follows the gang everywhere after. Before Blackwater, the Van Der Linde gang had already lived a long outlaw life. They robbed, moved, lied, fought, and survived by staying ahead of the law. Dutch built the gang around a dream. Freedom outside civilization, a family for people society had rejected, a rebellion against rich men, banks, government, and respectable cruelty. Hosea was the older voice of caution. Arthur was the dependable right hand. John was the restless son who had returned after abandoning the gang for a year. Abigail, Jack, Susan, Pearson, Tilly, Mary Beth, Uncle, Javier, Bill, Lenny, Sean, and the others formed a moving camp of thieves, survivors, and lost souls. They were not innocent, but they were not yet fully broken. Blackwater sits at the edge of that old life like a storm line. The gang had been operating out west and had apparently found a major opportunity, a ferry carrying money. Depending on who is speaking, it was a promising score, a mistake, a setup, or a plan pushed too hard by the wrong people. The job was meant to bring in enough money to help the gang escape pressure and move toward a new future. That was always Dutch's great promise. A little more money, a little more faith, a little more time, and then freedom would arrive. Blackwater was supposed to be the job that made that dream real. But the first thing to understand is that Dutch's dream was already becoming dangerous before the ferry. The gang was growing larger, louder, and harder to hide. The world was changing. Law enforcement was becoming more organised. Private detective agencies like the Pinkertons were hunting criminals with corporate backing. Towns were modernising. Railroads and telegraphs were shrinking distance. Well, the old outlaw life Dutch romanticised was being boxed in by systems bigger than any campfire speech. Blackwater was not just a botched robbery. It was an old way of life colliding with a new world that could track, corner and crush it. The ferry job itself is described as chaotic. Dutch, Micah and others were involved. Arthur and Hosea were not fully part of the robbery in the same way, and that matters. Arthur later says the job felt wrong, and Hosea had been working on a different scam, one that seemed safer or smarter. Hosea did not want the ferry robbery, or at least did not trust it. Arthur often trusts Hosea's instincts, even when he follows Dutch's orders. The fact that Hosea and Arthur were not at the centre of the ferry plan leaves a dark little space in the story. Now, if the gang's two best stabilising forces were not guiding the job, who was shaping Dutch's decisions? Micah Bell's presence around Blackwater is one of the most suspicious pieces of the whole disaster. He was a newer member of the gang, not someone with years of trust behind him, and yet he had gained Dutch's ear with dangerous speed. Micah always knows how to flatter Dutch's pride. He speaks the language of bold action, no hesitation, no weakness, no mercy for anyone outside the gang. If Hosea represents caution and Arthur represents loyal doubt, Micah represents permission. He gives Dutch permission to become the harshest version of himself and still call it strength. This is why so many people suspect Micah's influence in Blackwater, even before any confirmed betrayal later in the story. Whether or not he set up the ferry job directly, he seems like exactly the kind of man who would push Dutch toward a risky score and then thrive in the chaos afterward. Micah likes confusion. He likes bloodshed. He likes situations where old bonds are weakened and his own voice becomes louder. Blackwater gives him all of that. After Blackwater, the gang is scared. Hosea's caution looks too late. Arthur's doubts are buried under survival, and Dutch needs someone to tell him he is still strong. Micah is waiting. The robbery goes wrong in a way that suggests the law was ready. The Pinkertons and local forces respond with frightening speed. The gang is ambushed or cornered. People die. The streets and docks become a battlefield. The ferry job, which should have been a fast robbery, turns into a bloodbath. The gang loses control. And that loss of control is important because Dutch's identity depends on that he can read the world better than everyone else. Blackwater proves that maybe he cannot. It shows that Dutch can be surprised, trapped and outplayed. But the most infamous part of Blackwater is not only the failed robbery, it is the killing of Heidi McCourt. She is mentioned as an innocent woman Dutch killed during the chaos, a woman shot in the head, a woman whose death clearly disturbed people who had seen violence before. That detail matters because the gang is full of criminals, and criminals do not usually collapse over every death. Arthur has killed, Hosea has conned, John has robbed, Javier and Bill have fought. These are not sheltered people. So when Dutch's killing of Heidi McCourt becomes a whispered sign that something was different, it means the act crossed a line even by outlaw standards. The mystery is not only that Dutch killed her, it is why. Did he panic? Did he use her as a hostage and then murder her when the situation broke apart? Did he shoot her to prove a point? Did Micah encourage it? Did Dutch lose control in a moment of terror? Or did Blackwater reveal a cruelty that had been hidden under his charm for years? Red Dead Redemption 2 never gives a neat answer, and that is why the incident keeps its power. The silence around Heidi McCourt is more disturbing than a full scene might have been. We are left with the knowledge that Dutch did something awful, and the people who loved him had to carry that knowledge into the snow. Heidi McCourt becomes the first great crack in Dutch's myth. Dutch speaks of freedom, justice, family, and resistance to corrupt power. He does not speak like a man who wants to murder innocent women. That is what makes Blackwater so frightening. It is not the act of a simple villain who has always been honest about his cruelty. It is the act of a man whose beautiful language can no longer cover what his hands have done. After Blackwater, Dutch can still talk, still inspire, still command, but something has changed in the way his words land. Arthur hears it. Hosea hears it. Maybe Dutch hears it too, and that may be why he becomes so defensive. The gang also loses people in Blackwater. Davy Callander is mortally wounded and dies soon after in the mountains. Jenny Kirk is killed. McCallander is captured or killed, with his exact fate delivered through Lawman's words and grim implication. Sean Maguire is separated and captured, whereas John is badly hurt later in the escape through the mountains, mauled by wolves after being separated from the group. The Blackwater disaster is not a single moment but a chain of losses. By the time the gang reaches Coulter, it has already been bleeding for days. Davy's death at Coulter is one of the first images of the story, and it quietly ties the opening to Blackwater's unseen horror. He is not a character we get to know alive. He is a body carried out of one disaster into another. That is how the story begins, not with glory, but with a corpse from a job we did not see. Jenny is already gone. Mac is gone. Sean is missing. The gang enters the story already haunted by absences. Blackwater removes people before they can become memories for us, which makes the survivor's grief feel older than our experience. The money from the ferry robbery is also left behind near Blackwater, hidden or lost in a way that becomes almost mythic. Dutch insists they cannot go back for it, because the area is crawling with law. The money becomes the ghost of the plan, the proof that the gang almost had enough, almost escaped, almost won. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, Dutch keeps chasing new scores partly because Blackwater's money remains unreachable. It is like a buried promise. If they could recover it, maybe everything would be different. But the truth is darker. The money cannot fix what Blackwater broke. That is one of the saddest things about the incident. Everyone talks about money as if money is the problem. They need money to flee. They need money to buy land. They need money to get a boat. They need money for Tahiti, Australia, or wherever Dutch's imagination travels next. But after Blackwater, the real problem is trust. The real problem is Dutch's judgment. The real problem is the gang's growing visibility. The real problem is that the family has begun turning its own fear inward. Money can buy horses, guns, tickets, and food. It cannot restore the moral centre that was damaged on that ferry. Arthur's absence from the main ferry event is one of the story's most important choices. Arthur is the protagonist, the gang's strongest working hand, and Dutch's most loyal son. Yet the defining disaster before the story happens outside his direct view. This means Arthur spends the story trying to understand a wound he did not fully witness. He knows enough to be troubled, He trusts Hosea's suspicion. He hears what people say about Dutch killing a woman. He sees the aftermath, but he does not have complete knowledge. That incomplete knowledge mirrors the uncertainty surrounding the whole incident, and it makes Arthur's doubt feel natural. He's not suddenly disloyal. He's trying to make sense of a father figure who has done something he cannot easily explain away. Hosea's position is equally important. Hosea is not naive. He has been with Dutch for decades. He knows the gang's crimes, tricks and lies. If Hosea is disturbed by Blackwater, then Blackwater is not ordinary outlaw misfortune. Hosea's caution carries moral weight because he understands Dutch better than almost anyone. He can see when Dutch is performing confidence to hide fear. He can see when a plan is too risky. He can see when Micah's influence is dangerous. After Blackwater, Hosea's quiet disappointment becomes one of the first signs that the gang's old balance has been broken. Before Blackwater, the Dutch and Hosea partnership seems to have worked because they balanced each other. Dutch had vision, Hosea had restraint. Dutch could inspire, Hosea could read the room. Dutch could turn hardship into meaning. Hosea could remind him when meaning was not enough. Arthur stood between them as the loyal executor, the man who could make plans real. Blackwater happens when that balance fails. Dutch pushes toward a reckless opportunity. Hosea's caution does not stop him. Arthur is not there to anchor the plan, and Micah's boldness fills the space. This is why the Blackwater incident feels like the beginning of Dutch's psychological collapse, even though the roots were probably there long before. Blackwater humiliates him, it stains him, it proves the law can outmaneuver him, it forces him to abandon money and people, it leaves a dead innocent woman behind. Dutch cannot process that honestly, because honesty would require admitting failure, fear, and guilt. Instead, he leans harder into faith. Her faith becomes less a comfort and more a demand. He needs the gang to believe in him because he is struggling to believe in himself. The opening in Coulter shows Dutch trying to turn disaster into purpose. He gives speeches in the snow, telling the gang they will survive, telling them they are safe for the moment, telling them the storm will pass. Some of this is good leadership. People are freezing and terrified. They need a voice. But beneath the comfort is something more fragile. Dutch is not only calming them. Yeah, he is repairing his image in real time. Every speech after Blackwater is a bandage wrapped around a wound he refuses to clean. Arthur listens to Dutch in Coulter with loyalty, but not blind peace. There is an unease in the way the story frames him. He still believes, because Arthur's loyalty is deep and old. But Blackwater has placed a question inside him. Did Dutch make a mistake, or did Dutch reveal himself? Those are very different fears. A mistake can be forgiven. A revelation changes the past. If Dutch killed Heidi McCourt in coldness, then Arthur has to wonder how long that coldness has been there, hiding under the speeches. That is too painful to face at once, so he does what Arthur always does early on. He works. Work is Arthur's way of postponing grief. The gang needs food, John needs rescue, Sadie needs shelter. The O'Driscolls need watching. The train robbery needs handling. Horses need riding. Guns need cleaning. Dutch needs support. Arthur can keep moving, and as long as he keeps moving, he does not have to sit alone with Blackwater's meaning. This is one reason the opening chapters feel so alive despite the disaster. The gang is busy surviving, and survival creates motion. But motion is not healing. Blackwater follows them down from the mountains like a shadow. The train robbery near Coulter can be seen as the gang trying to reclaim control immediately after losing it. They rob Leviticus Cornwall's train, taking bonds and creating a new enemy far more powerful than they fully understand. In practical terms, the gang needs money. In emotional terms, Dutch needs a victory. Blackwater made him look weak. So another bold job can restore the feeling that he is still the man with the plan. But that victory brings Cornwall's wrath and increases pressure. This is the pattern after Blackwater. Every attempt to escape consequences creates larger consequences. Cornwall matters because he represents the kind of modern power Dutch hates and underestimates. Cornwall is not just a rich man. He is money connected to law, industry, transportation, private security and political influence. Robbing him after Blackwater is like bleeding in water where bigger predators can smell it. Dutch frames such robberies as resistance, and there is truth in his hatred of men like Cornwall. But truth does not make the strategy wise. Blackwater should have taught caution. Instead, Dutch begins seeking restoration through escalation. The move to Horseshoe Overlook gives the gang temporary sunlight, and that temporary peace is important because it shows what Blackwater has not yet destroyed. People laugh. Javier sings, Sean eventually returns, Jack plays, Pearson cooks, Hosea jokes, Dutch reads. Arthur rides through green hills, and for a while the gang can almost pretend the ferry disaster was only a bad chapter behind them. Horseshoe is beautiful because it is fragile. It is the last place where the old dream still breathes with some warmth. But even at Horseshoe, Blackwater is present. The gang cannot go west. The law is still searching. The missing money is still unreachable. Dutch is still telling everyone they need one more score. Arthur still hears doubts from Hosea. The camp's laughter sits on top of unfinished fear. That is how trauma often works. Nay, it does not erase every good moment. People still eat, joke, sing and fall asleep. But underneath, something waits. Blackwater becomes the thing nobody can fully discuss without threatening the little piece they have left. Sean's return briefly feels like Blackwater giving someone back. He was captured after the disaster, and rescuing him restores a piece of the old gang. The party afterward is loud and joyful, filled with music, drinking and relief. But even that relief is haunted because Sean's survival is temporary. He will die in Rhodes, suddenly and violently, because the gang's pattern has not changed. Blackwater takes some people immediately. The life that follows takes others later. The disaster is not over just because the snow melts. John's relationship to Blackwater is also complicated. He is injured, separated, and then rescued in the mountains. He already carries tension with Arthur because he once abandoned the gang, and Arthur resents him for it. But Blackwater and its aftermath push John back into the family's danger. Abigail is afraid. Jack is vulnerable. John is not yet the father he needs to be. Arthur sees all of this long before he fully acts on it. In a strange way, Blackwater begins the chain that will eventually make Arthur save John. The disaster exposes how little future the gang can offer a child. For Abigail, Blackwater likely confirms fears she has carried for a long time. She knows the gang is not safe. She knows Dutch's dream cannot protect Jack forever. She knows that every score risks leaving her son fatherless, motherless, or worse. The men may talk about freedom, but Abigail has to think about bedtime, food, shelter. and whether lawmen or rival gangs will come riding in. Blackwater is not romantic to her. It is proof that the life can collapse overnight and drag children into the wreckage. Jack is too young to understand Blackwater fully, but his presence makes the disaster more tragic. The gang is not only a band of armed adults, there is a child in the camp. Every reckless choice echoes around him. Dutch's dream sounds different when Jack is nearby. Freedom for adults can become danger for children. After Blackwater, that contradiction becomes harder to ignore. The gang says it is a family, but a family should protect its children from the fire, not keep carrying them toward it. Micah's rise after Blackwater is one of the most chilling slow developments. At first he is unpleasant, but not yet dominant. Arthur dislikes him, Hosea distrusts him, and many in the camp seem uneasy around him, but Dutch keeps listening. Blackwater has made Dutch vulnerable to the kind of validation Micah offers. Micah does not ask Dutch to reflect. He does not ask him to admit fault. He does not ask whether Heidi McCourt's death means something is wrong. He tells Dutch, in one way or another, that strength means pushing on, that doubt is weakness, that the gang needs fewer mouths and harder hearts. The fact that Micah is later revealed as an informant after Guarma makes people look back at Blackwater with even more suspicion. Milton says Micah began working with the Pinkertons after the gang returned from Guarma, which means the story does not directly confirm Micah betrayed them at Blackwater. But fans have always wondered. The ferry job was too perfect a disaster. The law seemed too ready. Micah benefited too much from the aftermath. Even if he was not officially an informant yet, he may have been reckless enough or selfish enough to create the conditions for catastrophe. In the moral sense, he is guilty long before the law names him. That distinction matters. A person can betray a family before signing any deal with its enemies. Micah betrays the gang's spirit by feeding Dutch's worst instincts, by despising the weak, by treating people as dead weight, by enjoying chaos, and by seeing the gang not as a family, but as a ladder. Blackwater is the first great opportunity for Micah's worldview to gain ground. After the ferry, survival becomes harsher, trust becomes thinner, and Dutch becomes easier to isolate. Micah does not need to create every disaster if he knows how to use one. The Pinkertons also become more important after Blackwater because they represent the closing net. Agent Milton and Agent Ross are not ordinary local lawmen. They are patient, organised, and backed by money. They understand that the gang is weakened. They pursue them across states, appear near camps, pressure people, offer deals, and slowly tighten the world around them. Blackwater is the moment the gang stops being merely wanted and becomes hunted in a more focused way. The old trick of moving camp may still work for a while, but the distance is shrinking. Milton's conversations with Arthur are important because he often speaks like a man who knows the gang's story is over. He offers Arthur a chance to give up Dutch. Arthur refuses, partly out of loyalty and partly because Milton is still an enemy. But Milton's confidence is unsettling. He does not need to win every gunfight. Time is on his side. Civilization, paperwork, railroads, money and government pressure are on his side. Blackwater made the gang visible enough for that machinery to lock on. This is why the Blackwater incident is tied to the death of the West itself. The gang cannot simply ride into the horizon anymore. The horizon has telegraph lines. The horizon has banks, ferries, trains, newspapers, detectives, and government contracts. Dutch keeps speaking as if freedom is a place just beyond the next score, but Blackwater proves the map is closing. The gang may move from Coulter to Horseshoe, from Clemens Point to Shady Bell, from St. Denis to Guarma, from Lakay to Beaver Hollow, but the trap moves with them. Blackwater is the first loud sound of the door shutting. The ferry itself is symbolically perfect. A ferry is a crossing. It moves people and goods between shores. It is a liminal place, neither one side nor the other. The gang tries to rob a crossing and ends up crossing into a new phase of doom. Before Blackwater, they can still imagine themselves as outlaws with a plan. After Blackwater, they are fugitives dragging death and suspicion behind them. The ferry job is supposed to carry them toward freedom. Instead, it carries them into the story's long descent. Water appears throughout Red Dead Redemption 2 as danger, movement and separation. Blackwater has water in its name, and the ferry disaster begins beside water. Later, the gang crosses rivers, swamps, and oceans. They flee St. Denis by boat and are wrecked into Guarma. Dutch dreams of tropical escape across the sea. John will later build a life near different landscapes, but water remains connected to passage and loss. Blackwater's name feels almost like a warning. Dark water, hidden depth, a crossing where the bottom cannot be seen. The town of Blackwater itself also matters because it represents modernity more than the dusty frontier towns where the gang feels comfortable. It is more developed, more orderly, more connected to the world Dutch resents. Robbing there is not like robbing some isolated stagecoach on a lonely road. It places the gang inside a public, modern, watched environment. The failure suggests that Dutch's methods no longer fit the world he's trying to beat. He wants to remain a romantic outlaw, but Blackwater answers with coordinated force. Arthur is forbidden from entering Blackwater for most of the story because the wanted level there is too high. That restriction becomes part of the story feeling. Blackwater is not just a place on the map, it is a sealed wound. Arthur can ride near it, think about it, hear about it, but he cannot simply walk back in and clear things up. The past is geographically blocked. The money is there, the answers are there, the beginning of the collapse is there, and Arthur is kept outside. That distance keeps the incident mythic. The hidden money near Blackwater also becomes a test of Dutch's honesty. If the goal is truly escape, then recovering the money should be the central plan, but the area is too dangerous, and Dutch keeps chasing new money elsewhere. Over time, this makes his plans feel less practical and more psychological. He needs the idea of a final score more than he needs a realistic path. Blackwater's money is a real stash, but it also becomes an excuse. It lets Dutch say they almost had it, almost made it, almost escaped, if only the world had not betrayed them. That is how Dutch protects himself from guilt. Blackwater failed because of bad luck, lawmen, betrayal, weakness, or the cruelty of civilization. It cannot fail because Dutch was reckless. It cannot be about his pride. It cannot be about Heidi McCourt. It cannot be about listening to Micah instead of Hosea. Dutch needs a story where he remains the visionary wronged by the world. The tragedy is that the more he needs that story, the more people die inside it. Arthur's later diagnosis with tuberculosis changes how Blackwater feels in retrospect. At first, the ferry disaster seems like the wound that begins the gang's collapse. Later, Arthur's illness becomes another ticking consequence from a separate act of cruelty. beating Thomas Downs for Strauss's debt. These two disasters run side by side. Blackwater is the gang's disease. Tuberculosis is Arthur's. Both begin before their full meaning is understood. Both spread quietly. Both make old excuses impossible. By the end, Arthur is dying inside a gang that has also been dying since Blackwater. There is a strange parallel between Heidi McCourt and Thomas Downs. Both are victims who exposed the moral failure of the gang's life. Heidi is an innocent woman killed as a chaos of Dutch's failed ambition. Downs is a sick debtor beaten by Arthur in the machinery of the gang's survival. One death stains Dutch's image. The other infects Arthur's body and conscience. Together they show that the gang's violence is not only aimed at powerful enemies, it spills onto ordinary people. That truth is what the dream cannot survive. Arthur can face Thomas Downs later because the disease forces him to. He cannot face Heidi McCourt in the same way because she is Dutch's ghost, not his. But her death still shapes his understanding of Dutch. Arthur's redemption comes partly from realizing that the gang has hurt people who did not deserve it. Blackwater is the earliest sign of that realization, even if Arthur cannot fully say it yet. The gang's myth says they rob those who deserve it and protect the unwanted. Blackwater says innocent people can die when Dutch needs a score. Hosea's death in St. Denis can be seen as the final echo of Blackwater's failed lesson. Hosea knew reckless jobs in modern urban spaces were dangerous. He knew Dutch's pride could overreach. Yet the gang goes into St. Denis for another major robbery, and once again the law is ready. Hosea is captured and executed. Lenny is killed. John is arrested. The gang flees into chaos. St. Denis is Blackwater happening again on a larger, more final scale. The difference is that this time we see more of the disaster unfold. That repetition is part of the tragedy. Blackwater should have taught Dutch to stop. Instead, it teaches him to double down. Every later plan carries the same rhythm. Danger grows, Dutch promises escape. Someone questions him, he demands faith, the job collapses, people die, and the gang moves again. Rhodes with the Greys and Braithwaites, St. Denis with Bronte and the Bank, Guarma with the failed fantasy of escape, the Wapiti conflict with Eagle Flies, the final train robbery near the end. Blackwater is the first note in a song Dutch keeps playing until almost no one is left to hear it. The Rhodes chapter shows Dutch still believing he can outsmart old power structures. The gang plays two families against each other, thinking they are clever enough to control a feud they barely understand. Then Sean dies and Jack is kidnapped. Like Blackwater, a plan that looked profitable becomes personal disaster. The family has to ride to Braithwaite Manor to rescue a child, because their own schemes brought danger close to camp. Blackwater's lesson returns. Dutch's cleverness creates fires other people have to run into. St. Denis shows the same lesson under electric lights. Bronte humiliates Dutch, and Dutch's pride demands revenge. The trolley job fails. Bronte is drowned. The bank job collapses. Hosea and Lenny die. The gang flees by boat. This is not random bad luck. It is the Blackwater pattern repeated with more evidence. Dutch cannot bear humiliation, and his need to restore control drives him toward worse choices. The law and the modern world are not defeated by his boldness. They absorb it and punish the people around him. Guarma is the false promise of escape turned inside out. Dutch dreams of tropical freedom, but when the gang reaches an island, It is not paradise. It is exploitation, violence, and another fight that does not belong to them. Blackwater's missing money was supposed to buy escape across water. Instead, after St. Denis, water carries them into another nightmare. The fantasy keeps collapsing into the same truth. Dutch cannot flee himself. Wherever he goes, his pride, fear, and violence go with him. By the time the gang reaches Beaver Hollow, Blackwater's shadow has become almost total. The camp is sick, dark, divided, and suspicious. Molly is dead. Hosea is gone. Lenny is gone. Sean is gone. Kieran is gone. Jack and Abigail are in danger. John is doubted. Arthur is dying. Micah is stronger than ever. Dutch still talks of plans, but the words have lost their warmth. The family that fled Blackwater has become something unrecognizable. The incident did not destroy them in one blow. It began the slow process by which they destroyed themselves. This is why Blackwater is more than backstory. It is the seed of the entire game. Every major emotional line begins there or is sharpened by it. The Dutch's collapse, Arthur's doubt, Hosea's fear, Micah's rise, John's path toward escape, the Pinkertons' pressure, the missing money, the gang's eastward flight, the sense that the old world is ending. Blackwater is not shown because the whole game is its aftermath. We do not need to see the explosion to live inside the smoke. The mystery of Blackwater matters because the incident remains half hidden even after the credits. We know enough to feel its shape, but not enough to close the case. That is deliberate. If the ferry robbery were shown in full, it might become just another violent memory. By leaving it unseen, the story turns Blackwater into memory, rumour, and guilt. It becomes something the characters carry differently. Dutch carries it as humiliation. Arthur carries it as doubt. Hosea carries it as confirmation of fear. Micah carries it as opportunity. John carries it as another sign that the gang cannot protect a family. The law carries it as evidence. We carry it as a question. There is something very human about that. Many families have their own Blackwater, the event everyone refers to but nobody explains completely, the argument, accident, betrayal, or loss that changed the air in the room forever. People remember pieces, people disagree, some make excuses, some go silent, some build their whole future around never admitting what happened. The Van Der Linde gang is larger and bloodier than an ordinary family, but its emotional pattern is recognizable. A disaster happens, and instead of telling the truth, everyone tries to survive the story they can bear. Dutch cannot bear the true story. The true story would say he was wrong. It would say Hosea was right to worry. It would say Micah should not have been trusted. It would say Heidi McCourt did not deserve to die. It would say the money was not worth the cost. It would say the dream had become an excuse. Dutch cannot live inside that truth, so he creates another. They are victims of betrayal. They need faith. They need one more score. They need to keep moving. They need to silence doubt. That false story becomes more deadly than the Pinkertons because it controls the gang from within. Arthur's tragedy is that he spends most of the story slowly moving toward the truth Dutch refuses. He does not begin with perfect clarity. He begins loyal, angry, practical, and tired. But the contradictions accumulate. Dutch killed a woman in Blackwater. Dutch drowned Bronte. Dutch killed Gloria. Dutch abandoned John. The Dutch refused to rescue Abigail. Dutch trusted Micah. Dutch left Arthur to die. Each later event reaches backward and makes Blackwater clearer. What seemed like a frightening exception begins to look like the first visible sign of a pattern. That does not mean Dutch was always only evil. The tragedy works because he was more complicated than that. He did rescue people. He did build a family. He did oppose real cruelty in the world. He did give Arthur, John, and others a home when they had none. Blackwater is disturbing because it does not reveal that Dutch's ideals were fake from the beginning. It reveals that his ideals were not strong enough to survive his ego. Under pressure, the dream bends toward the man dreaming it. If Dutch cannot admit fault, then the dream must protect Dutch at any cost. Heidi McCourt's death is the clearest moral cost of that failure. She's not given a long biography in the story, but perhaps that is the point. She's an ordinary person swallowed by a legendary outlaw story. The gang's drama is huge to us, full of names we know and relationships we understand. But to Heidi, it may have been sudden terror, noise, a ferry, a gun, and the end of her life. Red Dead Redemption too often reminds us that outlaw legends are built on people who did not ask to be part of them. Blackwater places one of those people at the centre of Dutch's fall. The gang's reaction to her death also shows that they still had moral feeling left. If they were completely empty, nobody would care. But they do care, even if quietly. The fact that Arthur and Hosea are disturbed means the gang still has a conscience to wound. That makes the later collapse sadder. Blackwater happens while enough goodness remains for it to hurt. By Beaver Hollow, the same kind of moral shock barely has room to breathe because everyone is too exhausted, scared, or divided. The wound has become infection. One of the most haunting things about Blackwater is that it happens just before we meet Arthur properly. This means we never get to know the gang before the fall. We see glimpses in stories, camp memories, and the warmth of Horseshoe. But the pure old days are gone. Everything begins in aftermath, not innocence. Arthur's nostalgia for the gang is therefore partly inaccessible to us. We believe him because we see enough goodness to understand what he loved. But we also meet the family after the crack has already opened. That creates a subtle sadness from the very beginning. The Calendar brothers are part of that lost pre-game world. Davy dies before he can become more than a name and body. Mac is spoken of as wild and fierce, and his fate is delivered through Milton, who claims he died after being captured. Because we do not know them well, they become symbols of the gang's missing past. The people who might have told us more about Blackwater are dead. The story's witnesses are disappearing before the story even begins. That makes the truth harder to recover. Sean's capture also shows how Blackwater scatters identity. He is separated from the gang and later rescued, but the rescue feels like retrieving a piece of the old life from the jaws of the disaster. Sean brings noise, youth, and arrogance back into camp. His presence makes everything feel briefly more whole. Then Rhodes takes him away. And the loss feels sharper because we already know the gang cannot afford more absences. Blackwater begins the subtraction. The rest of the story continues it. Arthur's journal, if read alongside the story, feels like a quiet counterweight to Blackwater's missing record. He writes and sketches what he sees, trying to make sense of the world in his own rough way. But Blackwater itself remains a gap. That gap is important. Arthur can record the aftermath, but he cannot fully write what he did not see. His journal becomes a document of a man living after a disaster whose centre is hidden from him. That is part of why his later clarity feels earned. He has to infer the truth from patterns, not from one perfect revelation. The law's version of Blackwater is also incomplete because the law is not morally pure in Red Dead Redemption. The Pinkertons may be right that Dutch is dangerous, but they serve money and power, not justice in any clean sense. They are willing to threaten, manipulate, and kill. Their truth about Blackwater may be factually closer in some areas, but their motives are still ugly. This keeps the story from becoming simple. Dutch is guilty, but the world hunting him is not innocent. Blackwater is a crime, and also a historical turning point where corporate law tightens around outlaw violence. That tension is why Red Dead Redemption 2 feels so rich. It does not ask us to choose between Dutch's fantasy and the Pinkertons' order as if one is pure. Dutch's gang harms innocent people. The Pinkertons protect a society that also harms innocent people through banks, industry, racism, poverty, and state violence. Blackwater sits between those evils. A gang commits a bloody crime while trying to escape a civilization that is itself brutal. Arthur's later wisdom comes from refusing to hide inside either excuse. He sees that the world is cruel, and he also sees that cruelty does not absolve him. Another reason Blackwater feels untold is that the gang's own moral language starts changing after it. Before the disaster, Dutch can speak about helping the poor, resisting the rich, and living freely with enough warmth that even a skeptic can understand why people followed him. After Blackwater, the same language remains, but it begins to sound pressured. Freedom starts meaning obedience to Dutch's next move. Faith starts meaning silence when the plan feels wrong. Family starts meaning staying close, even when staying close becomes dangerous. The words do not disappear, they sour. This is one of the most realistic parts of the gang's collapse. A broken family often keeps using the same old loving words after the love has become tangled with fear. Dutch still calls them sons and brothers. He still speaks of loyalty. He still insists he is doing all of this for them. But Blackwater has changed the air around those words. The gang now has proof that Dutch can lead them into catastrophe, abandon people, lose money, and kill someone innocent. Once that proof exists, every future speech has to fight against it. Arthur's loyalty after Blackwater is therefore not simple blindness. It is the loyalty of someone who remembers too much good to accept one terrible event as the whole truth. He remembers Dutch saving him as a boy. He remembers Hosea's partnership with Dutch. He remembers campfires, rescues, jokes, then shared hunger and years of surviving together. Blackwater is horrifying, but memory protects Dutch for a while. Arthur does not want the man who raised him to be what Blackwater suggests, so he waits, he watches. He gives Dutch time to prove the incident was an exception. The tragedy is that Dutch keeps proving the opposite. Hosea may understand sooner because his love for Dutch is older and less childlike. He has seen Dutch over decades, through triumphs, failures, speeches, and pride. Hosea can love Dutch and still read him clearly. That is why Hosea's unease matters so much. He is not a disloyal stranger. He is the friend who knows the pattern. Blackwater tells Hosea that Dutch is slipping beyond the kind of correction that used to work. He can still advise him, he can still joke with him, he can still stand beside him. But something has shifted. Dutch no longer needs Hosea's wisdom as much as he needs people to confirm his own righteousness. The ferry robbery also tells us something about Dutch's relationship with spectacle. A ferry carrying money near a growing town is not only a practical target, it is dramatic. Dutch likes dramatic action because it fits his self-image. He does not want to be a petty thief hiding forever in ditches. He wants his crimes to feel like statements. He wants to strike at systems, at banks, at men with money, at symbols of the world he despises. That theatrical instinct can inspire people, but it can also make him reckless. Blackwater may have tempted him because it felt like a grand stroke, the kind of score that would prove the gang was still daring and alive. Hosea's preferred scams are often quieter, and he understands that survival sometimes depends on looking harmless, moving slowly, letting the mark come to you, and leaving before anyone realizes what happened. Dutch understands this too, but he is more easily seduced by drama. Micah is all drama with none of Hosea's caution. That makes the ferry job feel like the kind of plane where the gang's internal balance was already tilted. The quieter path lost, the loud path won, and once the loud path won, everyone had to live with the noise. There is also a question of pride. Dutch cannot stand being cornered, insulted, or made small. If something went wrong during the ferry job, if a hostage resisted, if the law appeared too quickly, if Dutch felt control slipping in front of his men, then pride may have turned panic into violence. And Heidi McCourt's death may have been the moment Dutch chose domination over restraint. That possibility is frightening because it means the killing was not random. It was psychological. A man whose identity depends on control may become most dangerous when control vanishes. This helps explain why Dutch later reacts so badly to doubt. Doubt reminds him of Blackwater. Every time Arthur questions him, every time Hosea warns him, every time John pulls away, Dutch hears the echo of that ferry. He hears the possibility that they all know he failed. Instead of admitting the failure, he treats the doubter as the problem. This is how guilt becomes tyranny. Dutch cannot punish the past, so he punishes the people who make the past visible. Micah understands this instinct without needing to name it. He senses that Dutch wants to feel betrayed rather than guilty. Betrayal is easier for Dutch because it keeps him at the centre as the wronged man. Guilt would require him to lower himself, to say he harmed the gang, to say he killed an innocent person, to say the plan was not good enough. Micah feeds the betrayal story. He points suspicion outward. He encourages Dutch to see weakness, rats, softness, and disloyalty everywhere. After Blackwater, this is poison offered as medicine. The missing Blackwater money gives Micah another advantage. Money keeps the old dream alive while keeping everyone dependent on Dutch's next decision. If the gang had the money immediately, they would have to decide what freedom actually means. Where do they go? Who gets what? Does everyone stay together? Does John take Abigail and Jack away? Does Hosea retire? Does Arthur finally rest? But because the money is lost, Dutch can keep promising a future without ever delivering one. The absence of the money protects the fantasy. That may be why the stash feels almost cursed. It is not cursed by ghosts in the usual Red Dead sense. It is cursed because everyone gives it too much meaning. To Dutch, it is proof that salvation was stolen from him. To the gang, it is the imagined answer to hunger and fear. To Micah, it is a prize. To John later, it becomes a means to build a home, but even then it carries blood with it. Money in Red Dead often feels heavy because it never arrives clean. The Blackwater money is heavy with Jenny, Davy, Mac, Heidi, and every death that followed the attempt to replace it. The incident also changes how we should hear Dutch's early kindness. In Coulter and Horseshoe, the Dutch can still be warm. He comforts Sadie. He speaks gently to people. He appears concerned for the gang. That warmth is not simply fake. The danger of Dutch is that his love and ego live in the same house. Blackwater does not mean Dutch never cared. It means his care could be overridden by pride, fear, and the need to preserve his own myth. That is a more disturbing kind of failure than pure villainy. A man can love people and still destroy them if he loves his own image more. Arthur's slow recognition of that truth is one of the quiet threads running from Blackwater to the mountain. He does not wake up one morning and decide Dutch is lost. He collects evidence against his own heart. Blackwater, Bronte, Gloria, Molly, John, Abigail, Eagle Flies, Micah. Each event hurts because it adds to a case Arthur does not want to win. By the end, when Arthur says he gave Dutch all he had, Blackwater is part of what he gave. He gave Dutch the benefit of the doubt after a disaster that maybe should have broken that faith immediately. For John, Blackwater becomes part of a different lesson. John has already left the gang once and returned, which makes him both guilty and more capable of imagining life outside. After Blackwater, the danger to Abigail and Jack becomes harder to ignore. John is slow, flawed, and often frustrating, but he eventually understands what Dutch refuses. Family cannot survive forever inside outlaw mythology. Arthur helps him reach that truth. Blackwater is one of the early reasons the truth is necessary. A child cannot be raised safely under a leader whose plans end with dead innocents and missing money. Abigail's fear is practical wisdom. She may not know every tactical detail of the ferry job, but she knows what its aftermath means. She knows the gang has less safety than it pretends. She knows Dutch's speeches do not stop bullets. She knows Jack is growing up around men who might die any day. The story often gives its clearest survival instincts to people Dutch underestimates. Abigail is not dazzled by the dream, because she has to think about the morning after the dream fails. Blackwater is exactly that morning. Sadie Adler enters the gang because of another violent disaster, and her arrival near the beginning creates a contrast with Blackwater. Sadie's home is destroyed by O'Driscolls. Her husband is murdered. She's pulled into the gang's orbit because she has nowhere else to go. The gang offers her shelter, just as it once offered shelter to Arthur, John, Tilly, and others. That is the old beauty of the Van Der Linde family. It takes in broken people. But after Blackwater, the family that takes Sadie in is already breaking. She is rescued by a collapsing shelter. Charles Smith too reveals what the gang could have been. Charles has violence in him, but he carries a steadier moral sense. He is capable of loyalty without worship. Around Blackwater's aftermath, a person like Charles becomes important because he shows that outlaw life does not automatically require Dutch's kind of denial. Charles can see when something is wrong. He can leave when leaving is right. He can help Arthur save John. He belongs to the gang, but he is not consumed by Dutch's myth. That makes him one of the people most able to survive the Blackwater shadow. E.R. Javier's path is sadder because his loyalty hardens in the wrong direction. Javier is intelligent, passionate, and capable of warmth. He believes in Dutch's ideals, perhaps because those ideals gave him a language for his own exile and struggle. After Blackwater, someone like Javier may cling harder to Dutch because the alternative is too painful. If Dutch is wrong, then what has Javier followed? If the family is rotting, where does he belong? Loyalty can become a shelter against unbearable doubt. By the standoff at Beaver Hollow, Javier's gun may be raised uncertainly, but his body is still on Dutch's side. Bill Williamson's loyalty is rougher and more dependent. Bill wants belonging, approval, and direction. Dutch gives him a place. After Blackwater, men like Bill are unlikely to challenge the leader because challenging him would mean standing alone. Micah's harshness and Dutch's suspicion push Bill toward the side that feels stronger. This is how a gang fractures. Not everyone becomes evil at once. Some people become afraid, some confused, some dependent, some opportunistic, and suddenly the room has two sides. Susan Grimshaw represents the camp's old discipline, and Blackwater must have been a nightmare for someone like her. She maintains order, chores, roles, and standards, because the gang's chaos needs a household shape. After the ferry disaster, that household is dragged into snow, death, and panic. Grimshaw can force people to work, clean, sew, and contribute. But she cannot repair the broken trust at the centre. Her later decision to stand with Arthur against Micah matters because she is not easily swayed by softness. She can sense when the old order has been betrayed. Molly O'Shea's tragedy also begins to make more sense in the long shadow of Blackwater. Dutch's attention moves increasingly toward crisis, plans, and validation. Molly wants love from a man who is becoming less able to love anyone without needing them to serve his self-image. After Blackwater, Dutch has less emotional space for genuine intimacy. He needs believers, not partners. Molly becomes isolated, humiliated, and desperate to be seen. Her false confession later is not about Blackwater directly, but it grows in the same poisoned soil, a camp where truth is unstable, and Dutch's affection has become dangerous to need. Even Pearson, Uncle, Mary Beth, Tilly, Swanson, and the others live under Blackwater's consequences. They may not make the plans, but they carry the hunger, fear, and displacement created by them. This is important because leaders often make disasters that ordinary members must absorb. A failed ferry robbery means people who never chose the plan now freeze in the mountains, move camps, hide from lawmen, lose friends, and wonder where the next meal comes from. Blackwater is Dutch's failure, but it becomes everyone's weather. The idea of an untold story also invites another question. Why does nobody tell it plainly later? Partly because the story wants mystery, yes, but inside the world the silence makes sense. To speak plainly about Blackwater would force the gang to judge Dutch. It would force them to name Heidi McCourt. It would force them to ask whether Micah pushed too hard. It would force them to admit the money might not be worth the life they are still sacrificing for it. Silence protects the family from immediate rupture, but it also lets the poison stay in the blood. Arthur is often blunt, but even he does not force the full Blackwater conversation early. He complains, questions, and watches, but he does not gather everyone around the fire and demand the truth. That would be almost impossible in the emotional structure of the gang. Dutch is not only a boss, he is father, preacher, symbol, and centre. Accusing him too directly after Blackwater would feel like attacking the family's foundation while everyone is still freezing. So the truth waits. The gang survives the week and loses the year. There is a painful lesson in that delay. Sometimes a group avoids the conversation that might save it because the conversation itself feels too dangerous. By the time the danger of silence becomes obvious, the damage is deeper. If Dutch had confessed honestly in Coulter, if he had said the plan failed, that he lost control, that Heidi McCourt's death was on him, that they needed to stop chasing grand scores and shrink the gang's risk, perhaps things could have changed. But that kind of humility is not Dutch's path. He chooses performance, and performance becomes destiny. Blackwater also reveals the limits of outlaw honour. The gang can have rules. They can say they do not kill needlessly, do not prey on the poorest, do not abandon family, and do not become like Colm O'Driscoll's men. But outlaw honour is fragile because there is no stable structure to enforce it when the leader breaks it. If Dutch crosses a line, who holds him accountable? Hosea can advise, Arthur can doubt, people can whisper, but Dutch remains Dutch. Blackwater shows that a moral code built around one charismatic man is only as strong as that man's willingness to be ashamed. This is why the comparison with Colm O'Driscoll matters. Dutch hates Colm and sees him as brutal, cheap, and dishonourable. But after Blackwater, the distance between them begins to narrow in uncomfortable ways. Dutch still has more warmth, more intelligence, more ideals, and more history of care. He is not Colm. But the question is no longer whether Dutch is better than Colm. The question is whether being better than Colm is enough. If innocent people die, if followers are used, then if loyalty becomes a leash, then the difference starts to matter less to the people caught underneath. The law uses Blackwater as proof that Dutch's gang is monstrous, and in some ways the law is right. But the law's version strips away the emotional complexity because lawmen do not care about the gang's internal grief. They do not care that Hosea warned against things, that Arthur is starting to doubt, that John has a son, that Sadie has just lost her husband, that many in the camp were not present when Heidi died. To the law, the gang is a single criminal body. Blackwater helps turn them into a target without individual souls. That is another tragedy. Dutch's choices make it easier for the world to erase everyone around him. The gang's inability to return west after Blackwater also changes the physical direction of the story. They are pushed east, deeper into territory where Dutch is less comfortable, toward Valentine, Rhodes, St. Denis and the swamps. The west, which should symbolise freedom in Dutch's mind, becomes blocked. The east, with its industry, old money, plantations, cities, and law, becomes the path of retreat. This reversed movement is one of the great quiet ironies of Red Dead Redemption 2. The gang that dreams of open freedom is driven into the tightening corridors of civilization. Every camp after Coulter can be read as a stage of exile from Blackwater. Horseshoe is the hopeful pause. Clemens Point is the warm deception. Shady Bell is the decaying mansion of false grandeur. Lakay is panic in the swamp. Beaver Hollow is spiritual ruin. The gang never truly settles because Blackwater has made settling impossible. Even when the scenery changes, the original displacement remains. They are always temporary, always watching the road, always waiting for the consequences to catch up. The physical absence of Blackwater from Arthur's accessible world also creates longing. It is a place the map names, but the story denies him. People can look toward it, but Arthur's wanted status makes it deadly. This turns geography into memory. Blackwater is there, but not for him. The past is there, but not reachable. The money is there, but not usable. The truth is there, but not spoken. Few games make a location feel so important by keeping it away for so long. The epilogue's return to the Blackwater region feels almost like walking through a scar after it has healed over on the surface. Jon can travel where Arthur could not. The town is growing. Life continues. People conduct business, ride roads, and build futures. The world did not stop because the gang suffered. That can feel cruel, but it is also true. History moves on from private catastrophe. For the Van Der Linde gang, Blackwater was the beginning of the end. For Blackwater, the town, it was one violent incident in a larger march toward modernity. That difference between personal and historical scale is central to Red Dead Redemption. The gang feels enormous to itself. Dutch's dream feels world-sized to the people inside it. Arthur's loyalty feels like a law of nature until it breaks. But the modern world absorbs them. Banks continue, towns expand, railroads run, Pinkertons take contracts. The ferry is replaced, repaired, or remembered only as a crime scene. The gang becomes story, then rumour, then history. Blackwater is where that shrinking begins. Still, within the human scale, Blackwater remains massive. It changes Arthur's last year. It shapes Jon's future. It gives Ross and the law a trail. It helps Micah rise. It stains Dutch's soul in a way even his own speeches cannot fully wash away. It separates the gang from the old world they understood, and pushes them into a landscape that exposes every weakness. The incident may be small in the official history of a growing town, but inside the gang's heart, it is an earthquake. The Blackwater incident also reshapes the meaning of Tahiti. Dutch's dream of mangoes, warm weather, and freedom sounds almost absurd later, but it comes from the same need Blackwater created. He needs a paradise strong enough to cover the disaster behind him. The more the gang suffers, the more beautiful the escape must sound. Tahiti is not a plan, it is anesthesia. It numbs the pain of Blackwater, St. Denis, Guarma, and every failed promise between. Dutch keeps describing paradise because he cannot describe guilt. For Arthur, the fantasy becomes less believable as death approaches. A dying man has less patience for vague paradise. He needs practical mercy. Jon must get out. Abigail must be saved. Jack must have a chance. Edith Downs must leave with her son. Rain's fall must not be used. These are small, concrete goals, and they stand in direct contrast to Dutch's huge, shapeless escape. Blackwater begins with a grand score meant to save everyone. Arthur ends by saving whoever he can reach. That is the moral journey away from Dutch. Jon's later return to Blackwater in the epilogue era gives the place another layer. By 1907, Blackwater is accessible, modern, and growing. Jon can move through the region in ways Arthur could not. The town is no longer only a forbidden wound. It becomes part of the world Jon must live in as he tries to build a lawful life. That shift is bittersweet. Arthur dies without ever freely returning to the place that began the collapse. Jon survives long enough to walk near the old ghost, but survival comes with its own future tragedy. The recovered Blackwater money, through the events surrounding Micah and Dutch at Mount Hagen, also shows how hollow the treasure becomes. Years after the ferry disaster, the money still exists, but it does not restore the dead. It does not heal Arthur. It does not make Dutch whole. It does not turn Micah into anything but Micah. Jon can use money to help build Beecher's hope, and that matters. But the treasure's myth is broken. It was never salvation. It was only money, sitting cold while people destroyed themselves trying to reach what it represented. Dutch appearing with Micah years later near that money is deeply revealing. After everything, Dutch is still orbiting the remnants of the old disaster. Micah has survived as a parasite on the past. John arrives carrying Arthur's memory. Sadie comes with vengeance and unfinished pain. The money, the snow, the guns and Dutch's silence all echo the beginning. This story returns to a cold landscape, as if Blackwater's shadow is stretched all the way to Mount Hagen. Dutch shoots Micah, but he cannot shoot the past. He leaves again, bust or unable or unwilling to explain himself. In that sense, Blackwater never truly ends. It begins the collapse of the Van Der Linde gang, but its consequences move through Red Dead Redemption 2, through the epilogue, and into the first Red Dead Redemption. John survives because Arthur helps him escape, but John is still a former member of the gang Blackwater exposed. The government later uses his past against him. Edgar Ross, who appears as part of the Pinkerton pressure, eventually becomes the man who drags John back into violence. The road from Blackwater leads, in a long and winding way, to Beecher's Hope, to Dutch's final cliff, and to John's own last stand. That is the full tragedy of the incident. It is not only a failed ferry robbery in 1899, it is a point from which the future bends. If Blackwater had not happened, maybe the gang would have continued west a little longer. Maybe Hosea's scam would have worked. Maybe Dutch would have had more time before his worst traits surfaced. Maybe Arthur would still have become sick from downs, because that part of the tragedy has its own path. Maybe Micah would still have found a way to poison Dutch. Maybe the law would still have closed in. Red Dead is not a world where happy endings wait easily, but Blackwater accelerates everything. It turns decline into collapse. There is no need to imagine Blackwater as a single secret that explains every mystery. That would make it too small. Its power is that it contains many kinds of failure at once. Strategic failure because the plan was wrong. Moral failure because an innocent woman died. Emotional failure because Dutch could not admit what happened. Family failure because trust began to fracture. Historical failure because the gang could not adapt to the changing world. Spiritual failure because the dream of freedom began requiring too much blood. The untold story of Blackwater is therefore not only what happened on the ferry, it is what the survivors did with what happened. Dutch turned it into a reason to demand faith. Micah turned it into an opening. Hosea turned it into worry. Arthur turned it into a question he would spend the rest of his life answering. John and Abigail turned it eventually into one more reason to seek a different life. The Pinkertons turned it into a trail. The dead turned it into silence. And the money turned into a myth sitting just out of reach. If we listen closely to the early camp, Blackwater is everywhere. It is in the way people talk around details. It is in the urgency to move. It is in the panic when lawmen appear. It is in the way Dutch insists he has a plan before the plan has a shape. It is in Arthur's tired obedience. It is in Hosea's eyes. It is in Micah's smirk. It is in the absence of Jenny, Mac and Davy. It is in Sean's missing voice before his rescue. It is in Abigail's fear for Jack. The incident is not shown because the whole camp has become its evidence, and perhaps that is why Blackwater remains one of the most haunting mysteries in Red Dead Redemption 2. it stays hidden, because trauma is often hidden. People survive first and explain later, if they ever explain at all. The gang never gets the luxury of sitting down together and telling the full truth. The law is behind them. The weather is killing them. Food is short. Dutch is speaking. Micah is watching. Arthur is working. Hosea is worrying. The dead are already gone. The story moves on because survival demands it, but the truth stays behind, waiting. By the time Arthur reaches his final days, he has learned the lesson Blackwater tried to teach from the beginning. A family built on lies cannot outrun the lie forever. A leader who cannot admit guilt will make everyone else pay for it. Money cannot redeem a rotten plan. Love is not the same as obedience. Freedom that requires innocent blood is not freedom anymore. Arthur learns these things late, but he learns them deeply. Dutch never truly does. The Blackwater incident is the first sunrise in reverse. It is the dark morning before the story opens, the moment the gang crosses from a troubled past into a doomed present. We never see the ferry clearly, but we see the faces of everyone who escaped it. We see their fear, their denial, their loyalty, their grief, and their refusal to stop. We see the long road that follows, and by the end, when Arthur gives John his hat and turns back toward his own death, Blackwater feels very far away and very close at the same time. Far away in miles and chapters, close because the same question remains. What does a person do after the dream has become a lie? Arthur answers by saving John. Dutch answers by walking away. Micah answers by reaching for money. Hosea, if he had lived, might have answered with sorrow and the truth. Heidi McCourt never gets to answer at all. That silence is part of the cost. Behind every outlaw legend are people whose stories were interrupted so someone else could chase freedom. Blackwater asks us to remember that quietly, or without turning away. To understand the rise and fall of the gang, it helps to remember that the rise was real, the warmth was real, the loyalty was real. Arthur did love Dutch. John did owe the gang his life in complicated ways. Hosea did believe there was something worth preserving. The songs at camp were not fake. The meals, jokes, rescues, arguments, and ordinary little moments between jobs were not fake. The tragedy is that a real family can still become dangerous when the person at the centre cannot admit fault. That is where Dutch matters most. He is not hard to understand because he is empty. He is hard to understand because he is full of contradictions. He is charming and cruel, idealistic and selfish, intelligent and delusional. He loves his people, but he also needs them to orbit him. He talks about freedom while demanding loyalty. He says he hates civilization, but he cannot live without an audience. After Blackwater, those contradictions stop being background tension and start becoming the engine of the collapse. The fall came slowly because the gang had enough love to survive many warnings. Blackwater should have stopped them. Rhodes should have stopped them. St. Denis should have stopped them. Guarma should have stopped them. Beaver Hollow finally shows what was already happening underneath. The dream had been turning into a cage, and Dutch had begun mistaking obedience for love. At the beginning, that storytelling has real power. The gang follows him because Dutch offers meaning. Many of these people are poor, traumatized, orphaned, hunted, rejected, or pushed outside respectable society. And Dutch gives them a language that turns exclusion into dignity. They are not failures. They are free. They are not criminals. They are rebels. They are not desperate people living outside the law. They are a family refusing to bow to a rotten world. That is emotionally powerful, and it is not entirely false. Dutch really does save people. This is the part that makes him complicated. He takes in Arthur when Arthur is young and lost. He takes in John. He gives people like Tilly, Lenny, Javier, Charles, and others a place to belong. He teaches reading, rhetoric, confidence, and survival. He creates a community that feels warmer than the world around it. If Dutch were only a manipulator from the beginning, the tragedy would be smaller. The pain comes from the fact that the gang's love for him is built on real history. Arthur's loyalty to Dutch is not stupidity, it is attachment. Dutch raised him. Dutch gave him a world view. Dutch and Hosea shaped Arthur's identity from boyhood. Arthur is not merely an employee questioning a boss. He is a son slowly realizing his father may be dangerous. That makes every doubt harder. When Arthur begins to see cracks in Dutch's judgment, he is not only evaluating strategy, he is grieving the collapse of the person who taught him what loyalty meant. Dutch's relationship with Hosea is one of the best ways to understand his mind. Hosea is not just Dutch's friend. Hosea is his regulator. He is the counterweight, the old con man who can puncture Dutch's theatrical impulses with practicality and humour. Hosea knows Dutch's ego, but he also loves him. He can challenge Dutch in ways most gang members cannot. While Hosea lives, Dutch still has someone beside him who remembers the man under the performance. When Hosea dies, Dutch loses more than a strategist. He loses one of the last people capable of pulling him back from himself. The gang before the story begins seems to have functioned through a kind of unstable balance. Dutch provided vision, Hosea provided caution, Arthur provided force and loyalty. Together they could survive. But by 1899, that balance is already failing. Dutch's plans are becoming riskier. Hosea is tired. Arthur is aging into doubt. John is beginning to want a life outside the gang. The law is closing in. Civilization is no longer distant. The emotional structure that held the gang together is under more pressure than it can bear. To understand Dutch, it helps to imagine the man before the collapse. Because the gang did not form around nothing. Dutch was not born on that mountain in Coulter, already screaming about faith while everything burned. He had decades before that. He had charisma before desperation made it ugly. He had ideals before those ideals became excuses. Hosea met him when both men were younger, sharper, and probably still able to laugh at the world without sounding like they were trying to conquer it. Together, they built something that was half criminal partnership and half wandering family. Dutch's early appeal came from the fact that he could make being outside society feel like a moral position rather than a failure. Many outlaws are simply outlaws because they have no other choice. But Dutch gave the life a philosophy. He read books. He quoted thinkers. Where he spoke as if robbing a bank could be part of a grand argument against industrial capitalism. To people who had been beaten down by poverty, racism, orphanhood, abuse or bad luck, that mattered. Dutch did not merely say, "Come steal with me." He said, "The world that rejected you is rotten, and we are better than it. That is intoxicating." A person who has been discarded by society may already feel ashamed. Dutch takes that shame and turns it into pride. He tells them they are not the problem. Civilization is. He tells them the respectable world is built on hypocrisy, and he is often right. Banks do exploit. Industrialists do crush workers. Lawmen do protect property more fiercely than people. Government agents do lie. Dutch's critique has enough truth in it to become believable. And that is exactly why it is dangerous when he starts using it to excuse himself. A lie that contains no truth is easy to reject. Dutch's worldview is harder because it is built from real observations. The Gilded Age is brutal. The frontier is closing. Men like Cornwall do represent a new form of power, colder and more systematic than an outlaw gang. The Pinkertons really are violent agents of capital and state authority. Dutch sees the ugliness of the world clearly enough to sound like a prophet, but he cannot see his own ugliness with the same clarity, and that is the fatal imbalance. Dutch's reading is important because it gives him language, but the more important thing is how he uses that language under pressure. He can turn fear into courage for a night, and early on that gift keeps people alive. Later, the same gift becomes more dangerous. Doubt becomes shame. Loss becomes proof that they must continue. A bad plan becomes a test of loyalty. Dutch often seems to believe himself while he speaks, which makes the damage harder to separate from sincerity. He's not only persuading the gang, he is persuading himself. There is a deep theatricality to Dutch. He does not simply enter rooms, he performs himself into them. The coat, the hair, the posture, the way he stands in camp, the way he addresses people, the way he raises his voice. Even when the gang is starving, Dutch behaves like a man who must remain visually and verbally larger than everyone else. This is not vanity in the simple sense of liking nice clothes. It is identity maintenance. Dutch has to look like the leader because if the image cracks, the faith cracks with it. The gang's campfire culture helps Dutch because it creates intimacy. People sing, eat, argue, play cards, share stories, and rely on each other. Dutch sits at the centre of that emotional web. The gang does not feel like a military unit. It feels like a family, and family loyalty is harder to question than professional loyalty. If a boss makes a bad decision, you can leave. If a father makes a bad decision, leaving feels like betrayal. Dutch benefits from that blurred line. Dutch's fatherly role is especially powerful with Arthur and John. He takes in boys who need structure and belonging. He teaches them to read, to shoot, to survive, to think of themselves as more than discarded children. But he also teaches them to locate their moral compass in him. That is the hidden cost. Arthur learns loyalty, but he also learns to distrust his own doubts when they conflict with Dutch. John learns family, but also learns that leaving Dutch's orbit can feel like treason. The gang's ideals are constantly spoken as if they are shared equally, but Dutch owns the interpretation. Freedom means what Dutch says it means. Loyalty means loyalty to the version of the family Dutch controls. Betrayal means challenging Dutch at the wrong time. This is how charismatic groups can drift without noticing. The words stay the same while the meanings shift. Everyone still says family, faith, freedom, but slowly those words begin serving the leader more than the people. Blackwater remains the first wound we never fully see, but by this point in the story it has already done its work. Dutch killed Heidi McCourt. The gang was shaken by it, and the people closest to him had to decide whether to treat that killing as an accident, a panic, or a revelation. The later chapters keep answering that question. Bronte, Gloria, John, Abigail, Eagle Flies, and Arthur all become part of the same pattern. When Dutch is forced to choose between humility and his own legend, he almost always protects the legend first. This is where narcissistic traits become visible. Dutch does not need to be diagnosed like a modern patient in a clinic. He is a fictional character in a violent historical world, but he clearly shows patterns associated with narcissistic psychology: grandiosity, need for admiration, sensitivity to criticism, a tendency to reinterpret failure as persecution, and difficulty seeing other people's needs when those needs challenge his self-image. Dutch loves the gang, but he also needs the gang to reflect his greatness back to him. His generosity often comes with ownership. Dutch gives people belonging, but that belonging has an emotional price. You must believe in him. You must stay loyal. You must accept his interpretation of events. If you question too much, you are not simply worried or thoughtful, you are losing faith. That is a very dangerous leadership style because it turns practical disagreement into moral betrayal. The group cannot correct the leader without becoming enemies of the leader's identity. Arthur's doubts threaten Dutch because Arthur is not a minor follower. Arthur is the gang's backbone. When Arthur questions him, Dutch cannot dismiss it as easily as he might dismiss Uncle's laziness or John's restlessness. Arthur knows him too well. Arthur has been there too long. Arthur's disappointment carries the weight of family. That is why Dutch reacts so sharply when Arthur hesitates. He hears not only disagreement, but abandonment. John threatens Dutch in another way. John's desire to protect Abigail and Jack points toward a future outside Dutch's myth. If John can leave, if John can become a husband and father more than an outlaw, then Dutch's entire ideology is challenged. Dutch says the gang is family, but John choosing his actual family reveals the tension inside that claim. Dutch wants the gang to be everyone's highest loyalty. Abigail and Jack make that impossible. Dutch often speaks as if civilization is the enemy, but he is also addicted to the romance of opposing it. He needs the enemy, the law, banks, industrialists, Pinkertons, Cornwall, the government, modernity itself. These forces are real and often brutal, but Dutch also uses them as psychological fuel. As long as civilization is monstrous, Dutch can remain heroic. The more cornered he becomes, the more he needs the enemy to be absolute, because absolute enemies justify absolute behaviour. This is why Leviticus Cornwall is such a useful opponent for Dutch's mind. Cornwall is rich, ruthless, industrial, and deeply tied to the systems Dutch hates. Robbing Cornwall feels ideological, not just profitable, but it is also strategically disastrous. Dutch keeps attacking power in ways that make power focus harder on the gang. He frames this as resistance, but increasingly it looks like ego. He cannot stand being small in a world controlled by men like Cornwall, so he strikes at them even when survival demands quiet. Dutch's repeated need for one more score is not only greed, it is avoidance. The phrase "one more score" suggests a future where everything will finally make sense. After this they will leave. After this they will be safe. After this the sacrifices will be justified. That future never arrives because it is not a real plan. It is a psychological horizon. It lets Dutch postpone accountability. If salvation is always one more robbery away, then today's suffering can always be explained as temporary. Tahiti functions the same way. Tahiti is not really a plan. It is a fantasy object. Mangoes, warm weather, freedom, no law, no civilization. Dutch uses Tahiti as a dream the gang can project hope onto, but the details are absurdly thin. How will they get there? How much money is enough? What will they do? Who will survive the journey? And Dutch does not need those questions answered, because Tahiti's purpose is emotional, not logistical. It keeps people moving. The tragedy is that many gang members want to believe. They are tired, they are scared. They have already sacrificed so much that disbelief would make the sacrifices feel meaningless. This is how destructive groups often maintain loyalty. The more people lose, the harder it becomes to admit the leader may be wrong, because admitting that means the losses may not have been leading anywhere. Dutch benefits from this sunk emotional cost, whether consciously or not. Micah Bell enters this fragile system, like poison designed for exactly Dutch's weaknesses. Micah flatters Dutch's ego. He encourages aggression. He frames caution as weakness. He treats loyalty as obedience to Dutch personally. They not care for the gang as a whole. Micah understands that Dutch wants to feel decisive, masculine, feared, and visionary. So Micah gives him that reflection. Where Hosea challenges Dutch, Micah validates the worst version of him. Micah does not create Dutch's flaws from nothing. That would be too easy. Micah amplifies what is already there. Dutch already has pride. Micah feeds it. Dutch already fears betrayal. Micah points at Arthur and John. Dutch already wants dramatic action. Micah calls it strength. Dutch already needs someone to blame. Micah supplies targets. This is why Micah is so dangerous psychologically. He is not persuasive because he is smarter than everyone. He is persuasive because he tells Dutch the story Dutch increasingly wants to hear. Hosea's death removes the counterweight at the exact moment Micah's influence becomes strongest. The St. Denis bank robbery is a catastrophe. Hosea is captured and executed in front of the gang. Lenny is killed during the escape. The plan fails publicly and brutally. Dutch loses his oldest friend, one of his brightest young men, and the illusion that the gang can still outmaneuver the modern world through cleverness. After St. Denis, Dutch is not simply grieving. He is psychologically exposed. Grief does not make Dutch kinder, it makes him more defensive. This is important. Some people become softer when loss breaks them open. Dutch becomes harder because grief threatens the story he needs to believe. If Hosea died because Dutch's plan was reckless, then Dutch must face guilt. If Lenny died because Dutch misjudged the situation, then Dutch must face responsibility. Instead, Dutch moves toward more blame, more certainty, more speeches, more desperate action. Guarma is a major psychological breaking point. The gang is ripped away from the map, from their routines, from the remaining structure of their identity. Dutch, Arthur, Javier, Bill, and Micah are stranded in a violent colonial conflict. Dutch sees oppression there, and he is not wrong. The island is brutal, Fusa is monstrous, but Dutch's response reveals how unstable he has become. He kills Gloria, an old woman who helps guide them, because he decides she cannot be trusted and because she asks for more money. Arthur sees it. Arthur is horrified. The killing of Gloria is one of the clearest signs that Dutch's moral boundaries have eroded. Unlike a gunfight, this is intimate and ugly. He strangles an elderly woman in a cave, then tries to explain it away. Arthur's reaction matters because Arthur has seen Dutch kill before, but this feels different. It feels small, paranoid, unnecessary. It resembles Blackwater in miniature. Dutch crossing a line and immediately needing the world to accept his justification. After Guarma, Dutch's paranoia becomes more visible. He begins seeing betrayal everywhere. He suspects John. He doubts Arthur. He listens to Micah. The gang has been infiltrated by informants and hunted by Pinkerton, so paranoia is not entirely irrational. But Dutch's paranoia becomes selective in a revealing way. He distrusts the people who challenge him and trusts the person who flatters him. That is not healthy caution. That is ego-protective suspicion. Molly O'Shea's death shows how badly the gang's emotional world has deteriorated. Molly claims she talked to the Pinkertons, but later Milton reveals she did not. She says it because she is hurt, drunk, desperate, and starved for Dutch's attention. Dutch has emotionally abandoned her, and her false confession becomes a suicidal act of protest. Susan Grimshaw kills her according to the gang's code. Dutch does not save her. The man who speaks endlessly about family has created a family where a lonely woman can die for trying to be seen. Dutch's relationship with Molly reveals another part of him. He loves admiration more than intimacy. Molly wants to be loved as a partner, not as another believer in his legend. Dutch does not know what to do with that kind of need once it stops flattering him. He becomes distant, irritated, dismissive, and in Molly's pain is not strategically important to him, so he fails to treat it as real until it explodes in front of everyone. Arthur's tuberculosis changes the psychological balance too. As Arthur becomes physically weaker, he becomes morally clearer. The disease strips away his illusions. He starts seeing the gang, Dutch and himself, without the old romance. Dutch, meanwhile, becomes more grandiose and defensive. The son is moving toward truth as the father moves toward delusion. That contrast gives the final chapters their emotional power. Arthur's illness also threatens Dutch because it changes Arthur's priorities. Arthur begins caring less about money and more about saving who can still be saved. He wants John, Abigail, and Jack to escape. He wants the younger and more vulnerable gang members to survive. Dutch wants one more plan. Yeah, Arthur wants an exit from Dutch's plans. That makes Arthur dangerous to Dutch's control. Dutch's abandonment of John during the train robbery is one of the moments where his collapse becomes undeniable. John is left behind, and Dutch seems far too willing to let him remain gone. Later, Dutch refuses to rescue Abigail when she's taken, even though the old Dutch would have thundered about loyalty and family. Arthur hears the contradiction. Sadie hears it too. By then, Dutch's definition of family has shrunk to those who still reinforce Dutch. This shrinking circle is common in authoritarian emotional systems. At first, the leader claims to act for everyone. As pressure rises, the real group becomes smaller. The loyal, the obedient, the useful, the flattering. Doubters become traitors. People with independent needs become burdens. Dutch does not say, "I only care about myself." He still speaks in the language of family and faith, but his behaviour reveals the truth. The family now exists to preserve Dutch's story. The O'Driscoll feud reveals Dutch's emotional history with violence. Colm O'Driscoll is not just another rival. He is a mirror from the old outlaw world, another gang leader with blood on his hands and followers to spend. Dutch hates Colm, but their feud also keeps Dutch locked in the past. Annabelle, the woman Colm killed, haunts Dutch's memory. Dutch killed Colm's brother in return. The feud is personal, cyclical, and almost ritualistic. It shows that Dutch has been living inside revenge long before the story begins. When Dutch captures Colm later, or when Colm captures Arthur, the feud feels less like strategy and more like old poison. Column sees through Dutch in some ways because he is part of the same dying ecosystem. They both use men. They both speak of loyalty. They both survive through violence. Dutch tells himself he is better, and perhaps he is in some ways, but the feud makes the difference feel less clean than Dutch would like. The Cornwall train robbery early in the story is a perfect example of Dutch choosing symbolic defiance over low-profile survival. The gang is in trouble after Blackwater. They need to disappear. Robbing a powerful industrialist train does the opposite, but Dutch cannot resist the target because Cornwall represents everything he hates. That robbery brings heat, but it also gives Dutch emotional satisfaction. He has struck at the machine. The problem is that the machine remembers. Strauss's money lending is another contradiction inside Dutch's family. Dutch speaks against the cruelty of banks and debt, yet Strauss operates a predatory lending business within the gang's economy. Arthur collects from desperate people, including Thomas Downes, which eventually leads to his tuberculosis. Dutch tolerates this because the gang needs money. The hypocrisy is glaring. They condemn exploitation while practicing their own smaller version of it. Arthur eventually sees this and throws Strauss out. Dutch never truly reckons with it. The Downes debt is one of the most important moral events in the story, even though Dutch is not directly present for the collection. Dutch's system creates the conditions. The gang needs money. Strauss lends. Arthur enforces. A sick poor man is beaten for debt. Later, the Arthur dies from the disease he contracts there. The entire romantic outlaw myth collapses into one ugly truth. The gang also hurts poor people. Not only banks, not only Cornwall, poor people. Dutch's ideology struggles with that truth because it complicates his clean division between the free gang and corrupt civilization. If the gang exploits the vulnerable too, then their moral superiority weakens. Arthur's late-game kindness toward Edith Downes and her son becomes part of his redemption because he recognizes this. Dutch does not. Dutch remains too invested in the larger myth to look closely at the small victims. The Rhodes chapter shows Dutch and Hosea trying to play aristocratic decay against itself. The Greys and Braithwaites are old southern families rotting under pride, racism and greed. Dutch thinks the gang can exploit that rot and walk away richer, but the families are not as foolish as Dutch wants them to be, and the gang underestimates how quickly manipulation can become vulnerability. Sean dies. Jack is kidnapped. The con becomes personal. Sean's death is another destabilizing moment because it is sudden, public, and humiliating. 1 second he is talking, the next he is gone. There is no heroic last stand, no speech, no meaning, just a bullet from an ambush. These sudden deaths chip away at Dutch's ability to keep the story romantic. The gang can sing around fires, but the world can still erase one of them mid-sentence. Dutch's response to Jack's kidnapping is emotionally effective because it aligns the gang behind a righteous cause. The assault on Braithwaite Manor is one of the moments where the gang looks most unified. Dutch, Arthur, John, Hosea, Javier, Bill and the others move together like a family with one purpose. For a moment, Dutch's leadership feels true again. The audience can understand why people follow him. He can give fear a direction. But after Jack is recovered from Bronte, Dutch cannot let the humiliation go. Bronte did return the child, but he also treated Dutch as a lesser criminal, a rustic fool. Dutch's later revenge is fueled by that insult. He tells himself Bronte is a monster, and Bronte is certainly dangerous, but the excessive nature of the killing reveals the personal wound beneath the moral language. Dutch is avenging his pride as much as protecting the gang. The trolley station job is another example of Dutch being baited by the illusion of opportunity. Bronte feeds them bad information, and Dutch follows it into disaster. A more cautious leader might treat the gift with suspicion. Dutch wants to believe he can still turn St. Denis into a playground for outlaw cleverness. The crash that follows is almost symbolic. Dutch's old confidence colliding with the modern city at full speed. The bank robbery after that feels like Dutch trying to recover control through scale. If the trolley job failed, go bigger. If Bronte humiliated them, hit the bank. If the city feels unbeatable, prove it can be beaten. But this escalation is exactly what destroys them. Hosea's death outside the bank is the image of Dutch's old life being executed by the new order. Lenny's death during the escape is the future being cut down behind him. After Guarma, the killing of Cornwall is another revealing scene. Dutch confronts Cornwall directly in Ansburg, and the conversation quickly becomes fatal. Strategically, killing Cornwall does not save the gang. It increases pressure. Psychologically, it allows Dutch to feel like he has struck the great enemy in the face. He can kill the man, but he cannot kill what Cornwall represents. Industry, capital, law, and modern power do not die with one body. Dutch's tragedy is partly that he keeps personalizing systems too large to shoot. The Wapiti storyline also reveals Dutch's willingness to use suffering when it serves him. Rain's Fall wants peace and restraint. Eagle Flies wants resistance against the government's exploitation. Dutch sees opportunity. He encourages conflict because it can distract the army and help his gang. He speaks the language of anti-government solidarity, and again there is truth in his criticism. The government is stealing from the Wapiti, but Dutch's support is contaminated by self-interest. He is willing to inflame another people's tragedy to cover his own escape. Arthur recognizes this, and his relationship with Rainsfall becomes a contrast to Dutch's exploitation. Rainsfall offers Arthur a vision of grief handled with dignity, restraint, and sorrow. Dutch offers rage disguised as liberation. Arthur, dying and morally awakening, is drawn to Rainsfall's sadness because it asks for responsibility rather than spectacle. Dutch cannot accept that kind of restraint because restraint does not make him feel powerful. Eagle Flies' death is another consequence Dutch avoids feeling fully. The young man is brave, angry, and manipulated by the conditions around him. Dutch does not create the government's oppression, but he uses the conflict for his own ends. When Eagle Flies dies saving Arthur, the cost becomes personal. Dutch's grand war against civilization has helped consume another young life that was not his to spend. The train job near the end is framed as one last chance, but by then the phrase has lost all credibility. The gang has heard it too many times. One more job, one more score, one more plan. Dutch keeps promising arrival, but the pattern itself has become the destination. The gang is no longer moving toward freedom. They are orbiting Dutch's inability to stop. Abigail's capture by Milton reveals the final moral split. Dutch does not want to rescue her. Arthur and Sadie do. In the old family myth, leaving Abigail would have been unthinkable. By this point, Dutch's priorities are exposed. Abigail is not central to his plan, and John is suspect, so her life becomes negotiable. Arthur's decision to rescue her is a rejection of Dutch's hierarchy. He chooses actual loyalty over declared loyalty. Milton's revelation that Micah has been informing since Guarma confirms Arthur's suspicion, but comes too late to save the gang. It is psychologically perfect that Dutch struggles to accept this truth, even when it explains everything. Accepting Micah's betrayal means admitting Arthur was right. Hosea would have been right, and Dutch's judgment failed catastrophically. For Dutch, truth is not only information, it is humiliation. So he resists it until reality corners him. Arthur's final confrontation with Dutch is devastating because Arthur does not ask for much. He does not ask Dutch to fix everything. He does not ask him to become perfect. He asks him to see Micah, to see the betrayal, to see Arthur. Dutch cannot, or he can, but only too late and not enough. His silence on that mountain is one of the most psychologically revealing moments in the story. Dutch has no speech left that can hold the contradictions together. When Dutch walks away from Arthur, he is walking away from the person who most clearly represents his failed fatherhood. Arthur gave Dutch loyalty for decades. Arthur killed for him, stole for him, believed in him, defended him, doubted himself for him. At the end, Arthur is dying and telling the truth. Dutch cannot meet that truth, so he leaves. It is cowardice, but not simple cowardice. It is the collapse of a man who cannot survive the reflection Arthur offers him. In the high honour ending, Arthur dies facing the sunrise. That image is often discussed as Arthur's redemption, but it is also Dutch's indictment. Arthur, the outlaw Dutch raised, finds moral clarity at the end. Dutch, the man who preached ideals, walks into darkness. The son becomes what the father pretended to be, someone willing to sacrifice himself so others can live free. By the epilogue, Dutch is a ghost of himself. When John finds him with Micah on Mount Hagen, Dutch seems hollow, almost detached from the grand performance he once lived inside. He shoots Micah, but even that action is ambiguous. Is it revenge? Shame? A final rejection of the man who exposed what Dutch became? Maybe all of it. And Dutch does not explain himself because explanations are no longer enough. He simply walks away, leaving the money behind. Leaving the money is important. For years, Dutch said money was the answer. Money for escape, money for Tahiti, money for freedom. At Mount Hagen, the money is sitting there, and Dutch abandons it. This suggests that money was never truly the point, not by itself. The point was the dream, the control, the story of being on the verge of deliverance. Once the gang is gone and the dream is dead, the money loses its magic. Looking at Dutch through Red Dead Redemption, one changes the feeling of Red Dead Redemption 2. In the first game, Dutch is already the ruined version. He is older, harsher, and more openly nihilistic. He still speaks with intelligence, but the warmth of the gang father is mostly gone. John is hunting him not as a confused son still inside the family, but as a former follower facing the ghost of the man who shaped him. Red Dead Redemption 2 makes that future hurt more, because it shows what Dutch once was, or at least what people once believed he was. The Dutch of 1911 still hates the government, still hates civilization, and still sees himself outside ordinary law. But his rebellion has become thinner. He leads native men and outcasts in ways that echo his old pattern, but there is less pretense of building a loving family. He still uses the rhetoric of resistance, yet the bitterness is more exposed. The dream has lost its softness. What remains is grievance, violence, and the need to keep standing against a world that has already moved on. John's conversations with Dutch in 1911 are full of exhausted recognition. Yes, John knows Dutch's language. He knows the rhythm of the speeches. He knows how Dutch turns defeat into philosophy. But John is no longer a boy trying to earn Dutch's approval. He has become a father trying to protect his own family from the consequences of the old life. This reversal is crucial. John once threatened Dutch by wanting to leave. In Red Dead Redemption 1, John's attempt to live outside Dutch's myth becomes the whole reason he must confront him. Dutch's final moments in Red Dead Redemption 1 are strangely lucid. He tells John that their time has passed. He recognizes, at least briefly, that men like them are being erased by the modern world. But his clarity does not lead to humility or repair. It leads to death. Dutch cannot imagine becoming ordinary. He cannot imagine surrendering to a world where he is not a symbol. His final act is to step off the cliff rather than be captured and reduced. That suicide is consistent with his psychology. Dutch can tolerate danger, but not diminishment. Capture would mean being processed by the state, displayed as a criminal, stripped of the last scraps of myth. By choosing death, Dutch controls the final image. Even in defeat, he refuses to let the system put him in a cage. There is a tragic dignity there, but also the same old ego. Dutch would rather become a legend falling than a man answering questions. His death also leaves John with no real closure. John does what the government demands, but it does not save him. The system Dutch warned about still consumes John. This is part of the larger Red Dead tragedy. Dutch is wrong in how he lives, but not completely wrong about the world. The government really is ruthless. Civilization really does devour outlaws and then discard the tools it used to catch them. Dutch's critique survives him, even though Dutch himself is corrupted by it. This is why the Red Dead series refuses easy moral comfort. Dutch is dangerous, manipulative, and responsible for enormous suffering. But the forces opposing him are not pure justice. The Pinkertons, the Bureau, industrial capital, expansionist government power, and the machinery of modern law are also violent. Arthur and John are trapped between a false father and a cold state. Dutch's failure does not make civilization innocent. Civilization's brutality does not make Dutch righteous. Dutch's tragedy, then, is that he sees enough truth to become persuasive, but not enough truth to become wise. He sees the cruelty of the system. He sees the hypocrisy of rich men. He sees that law often serves money. He sees that freedom is being fenced, bought, and policed. But he cannot see that his own camp has become another little kingdom of control. He can diagnose the disease outside him, while spreading another disease inside the people who trust him. Arthur's redemption exposes Dutch more than any Pinkerton ever could. The law can call Dutch a criminal, but Dutch already rejects the law's moral authority. Arthur's judgment matters because it comes from inside the family. Arthur has lived Dutch's ideals, committed Dutch's crimes, and believed Dutch's words. When Arthur chooses to help John escape, he does not side with civilization. He sides with the human meaning Dutch claimed to believe in. That is why Arthur's final actions are so damning. Arthur becomes free when he stops needing Dutch's approval. This is a quiet psychological liberation. For most of his life, Arthur's self-worth is tied to usefulness within the gang. He is the enforcer, the provider, the loyal son. Tuberculosis destroys the future he thought he had, but it also frees him from the endless bargain of earning Dutch's praise. With death approaching, Arthur can ask a simpler question: who can I still help? Dutch cannot answer that question because helping others has become secondary to preserving the dream. John's escape is Arthur's answer to Dutch's failure. Dutch talked about freedom for decades. Arthur creates one small piece of it by getting John back to his family. It is not grand. It does not overthrow the government. It does not save the gang. It does not undo the past, but it is real. That difference matters. Dutch increasingly offers imaginary salvation. Arthur offers practical sacrifice. In the moral universe of Red Dead Redemption 2, practical sacrifice is worth more than beautiful speeches. Micah's survival, until Mount Hagen shows the lingering infection of Dutch's final choices. Micah represents the version of the outlaw life stripped of romance, greed, cruelty, betrayal, domination. Dutch choosing Micah over Arthur is the symbolic death of the gang's ideals. Years later, Dutch shooting Micah may be the closest he comes to admitting that choice was wrong, but he does it too late. After Arthur is dead, the gang is gone, and John's future is already shadowed. Dutch's silence after shooting Micah is more powerful than another speech would have been. For once, words fail him. He cannot explain himself without exposing too much. If he says he came for revenge, why so late? If he says he did not know, how can he face what Arthur told him? If he says he is sorry, who is left to receive it? So he leaves. Dutch's final gift to John is not wisdom, apology, or blessing. It is an opening, and even that opening is stained by years of damage. The money left behind at Mount Hagen becomes almost absurd. The gang chased money through snow, mud, blood, cities, islands, and caves. People died for it. Dutch preached that money would buy escape. Yet when the chest is finally there, Dutch does not take it. This reveals the emptiness at the centre of the chase. Money was always a symbol for a future Dutch could describe but not build. When the people who made the dream feel alive are gone, the symbol becomes dead weight. And now the camp grows quiet again. The fire sinks lower. The horses breathe softly in the dark, and somewhere beyond the trees the road waits, empty and cold. The rise and fall of the Van Der Linde gang is not only a story about outlaws losing to the law, it is a story about a family that could not survive the lies holding it together. It rose because wounded people needed hope. It fell because hope became obedience, and obedience became betrayal. Dutch wanted freedom, but he could not free the people he loved from himself. Hosea tried to hold the centre, but the centre broke. Arthur learned the truth too late, but not too late to save John. John carried the cost into another life, and even that life could not escape the past completely. The gang disappeared, but the lessons remained, drifting through snow, dust, swamp, and sunrise. If you are still awake, let the camp settle into memory now. Let the old songs fade. Let the lanterns dim. Let the road stretch away into the dark. I hope you sleep well, dream softly, and find a little peace beside the fire. Good night.